Rejoice, episode 113, Under a Cloud. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. First piece of text this week. In fact, I think it's the only piece of text this week. Let me just look again, because this time thing is... No, it's not. It's the first piece of text this week. It's a continuation of the paragraph from chapter 3 that I had to break in half last week, owing to the pressures of time. Remember what was going on? Stephen has just had the thought that his writings, written on green oval leaves deeply deep, would have copies sent, if he died young, to all the great libraries of the world, including Alexandria. And the thought goes on. This is where I'm picking up this week. Stephen's still thinking. Someone was to read them there after a few thousand years. A Mahaman Vantara. Pico de la Mirandola like. Aye, very like a whale. When one reads these strange pages of one long gone, one feels that one is at one with one who once... I got to read it again, because there's a kind of music to it. You'll see my point. That difficult word is Mahaman Vantara. Mahaman Vantara. Someone was to read them there after a few thousand years. A Mahaman Vantara. Pico de la Mirandola like. Aye, very like a whale. When one reads these strange pages of one long gone, one feels that one is at one with one who once. Well, there we go. Stephen is mockingly, or maybe not so mockingly, imagining his great works, his epiphanies being read in such libraries as Alexandria and the great libraries of the world. Joyce was not modest about how long-lived his writing might become, and let's be honest, wasn't he right? Because apart from saying that he'd keep the professors busy for years, a Mahaman Vantara, a Sanskrit word, denotes a spiritually long time span of some 340, I think, quadrillion years. That's billion years. Certainly squillions of years. Ah, that's okay. I can go with that. He will be read in that length of time. Here's the thing I love. Pico della Mirandola like Pico della Mirandola, or Mirandola maybe. Pico was a 15th century Italian scholar who, a year older than Stephen is at this juncture, produced a paper with the modest little title, On Everything Knowable. Actually, I wish that Joyce had dilated a little here on Pico, because he's worth a movie. He's one of the most interesting figures in the entire thought renaissance. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Della Mirandola. He was 21 when he died. No, that can't be right. Was he? He wasn't. He was in his 30s when he died. I'll check that. I'll come back to you later. But he'd already done enough to annoy the Pope and get thrown in jail. His big bag was syncretism. He wanted people to accept that as systems of thought and belief could be reconciled on the basis of their shared truths, the world would get better. I'll tell you that again. He wanted syncretism. He wanted people to accept that systems of thought and belief could be reconciled on the basis of their shared truths. Catholic and Protestant. See? Fat chance of that. And can you imagine how the upper echelon of disparate religions would view all that today, or at any time? It's lovely of Joyce to include him here, and I have a sneaking suspicion, and it's all right if it's true, that Joyce included him as much for the music of his name as for his failed but gallantly attempted philosophies. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Della Mirandola. Either way you say it. Della Mirandolo. Della Mirandolo. Either way you say it is lovely. Now, here's the kind of thing for which Joyce is famous. That name is followed by a sudden moment, a sudden unconnected moment, when Stephen has a thought which says, aye, very like a whale. And you say to yourself first, what the hell's this about? And then you might say, where do I know that from? Answer 1, what the hell's this about? I'll tell you in a second. Answer 2, you know it from Hamlet. This is what's happened. Stephen, in the midst of this thought, walking along by the sea, looks up and sees an egregious cloud. There'll be a bit about clouds here and there in Ulysses. So that's the answer to my second question. But what's it doing here? Hamlet, that's what. Do you remember that I was saying in chapter 1 how Stephen is kind of a Hamlet clone, in a way? The moody young man whom no one understands, the brilliant young man. And do you remember how Hamlet tries to give the mischievous impression, actually quite the malicious impression, that he has gone or is going mad? Well, there's a scene in which Hamlet uses the phrase, very like a whale. It's a famous scene. I have it here. I have my wonderful Yale Shakespeare here beside me, and I'll read it to you. I marked it the other day. It's Act 3, Scene 3. No, it's Act 3, Scene 2. God, this thing weighs a ton. Hold on. It's when Hamlet meets Polonius, Ophelia's father. Polonius is an innocent, harmless sort of courtier. And Polonius tells Hamlet that his mother, the queen, is looking for him. And Hamlet begins to bait him. He will later kill him. Here's the actual quote. Enter Polonius. Hamlet says, God bless you, sir. Polonius says, my lord, the queen would speak with you unpleasantly. Hamlet, do you see yonder cloud that's almost in shape of a camel? Polonius, by the mass, and 'tis like a camel indeed. And Hamlet says, methinks it is like a weasel. Polonius, it is backed like a weasel. Hamlet, or like a whale. Polonius is very like a whale. Then I will come to my mother by and by. And that's the actual quote. I love that Yale Shakespeare. And that's the cloud connection. There's one more sentence, by the way, in that paragraph, in Stephen's thoughts about libraries and clouds, and his works to be read forever. Here it is again. It's an unfinished sentence. When one reads these strange pages of one long gone, one feels that one is at one with one who once... He's imagining some academic somewhere writing about his epiphanies, and Joyce deliberately parried his academic writing, which in his day particularly never used the personal pronoun, and which tried to distance itself from its own opinions while actually giving those opinions. If you go back over 19th and early 20th century works of criticism from the likes of, say, Matthew Arnold, or The Monument That Was Walter Pater, or The Lethal Leavises of Cambridge, or even Oscar Wilde himself, though he might have been joking, you'll find they use this distancing one everywhere. And here, Joyce is having a go at them. When one reads these strange pages of one long gone, one feels that one is at one with one who once. It's the pomposity and the distancing he's having a go at. Good for him. It's one of the things I like about Bernard Shaw. He wasn't at all the worst offender in this department. Okay, let's move on to a very well-known passage, and I only have time, I think, to read it to you, and I'll begin to unpack it next week. Here's the next full paragraph. The grainy sand had gone from under his feet. This is Joyce now. This is third-person narrative. His boots trod again a damp, crackling mast, razor shells, squeaking pebbles, that on the unnumbered pebbles beats. Wood sieved by the shipworm, lost armada, unwholesome sand flats, waited to suck his treading soles, breathing upward sewage breath, a pocket of seaweed, smouldered in sea fire under a midden of man's ashes. He coasted them, walking warily. A porter bottle stood up, stogged to its waist, in the cakey sand dough, a sentinel, isle of dreadful thirst. Broken hoops on the shore, at the land a maze of dark, cunning nets, farther away chalk-scrawled back doors, and on the higher beach a drying line with 2 crucified shirts. Ringsend, wigwams of brown steersmen and master mariners, human shells. Let's dwell for a moment on just a few of the images and enjoy them. Some are visual, some are auditory, audible even, squeaking pebbles. And what's that about? Unwholesome sand flats waited to suck his treading soles. Can't you feel it under your feet? And watch out for that word sea fire. And don't you love chalk-scrawled back doors, and on the higher beach a drying line with 2 crucified shirts? Can't you just see it? Oh, great. All that and more here next week. Rejoice. Episode 114, Nets and Shells. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Remember how we ended last week? With a sigh of relief and gratitude for some third-person narration, the author being the third party to the characters, Joyce's own voice. Here's the passage I read, but I didn't have time to unpack it. If you can at all, have a copy of Ulysses open in front of you now. I'm hearing from people who tell me how much they love looking at the words as they're listening to the podcast. Here we go. And again, remember Joyce's trick of mixing first-person thought into third-person narration with no warning. As I read this, I'll try to identify for you and separate which is which, the first-person thought and the third-person warning. And this week only, I'm doing something different. I'm opening out as I go along, only because I read the passage last week. Here we go. Here's the first quote. The grainy sand had gone from under his feet. His boots trod again a damp, crackling mast. That's Joyce the narrator. Stephen has moved on to a different texture on Sandybound Strand. He's on floats of washed-up seashells. That tide line that you so often see that cracks under your shoes and that you daren't walk on barefoot. Razor shells, squeaking pebbles that on the unnumbered pebbles beats, wood sieved by the shipworm, lost armada. Now that's Stephen thinking. Do you recognize any of it? Of course you do. And again I reach for my mighty Yale Shakespeare. And for the unnumbered pebbles, I go to King Lear, Act 4, Scene 6. And it's heartbreaking. The power of Gloucester's enemies has done its courtesy to their wrath, as Shakespeare puts it, and they have put out Gloucester's eyes. In that famous scene that I've never been able to bear watching, I've maybe seen a dozen King Lears. Now Edgar, his own son, is leading poor blind Gloucester, who wants to throw himself off the cliffs of Dover. And Edgar convinces his dear father that the flat beach they're standing on is really the top of the cliff. Here's the full line. Edgar is pretending to look down, far down. The fishermen, he says, that walk upon the beach appear like mice. And then he says, because the sea is calm, the murmuring surge that in the unnumbered idle pebble chafes cannot be heard so high. You can't hear, he's saying to his father, you can't hear the sea from up here because we're up so high. And Edgar goes on to pretend to his father that they are up so high, that if he continues to look down, he'll get dizzy. He, Edgar, will get dizzy. I'll look no more, lest my brain turn. It's a wonderful piece of theatre, full of humane trickery and dramatic stratagem. I love it, actually. You know, they're walking along the top of the cliff, and he's pretending to his poor, blinded, distraught, catastrophized father that they're walking right in the edge so that his father can jump. Oh. You know, I'm wondering, too, if Joyce wasn't also thinking of Matthew Arnold, whom he mentioned in Chapter 1 of Ulysses, the gardener's face at Oxford, Matthew Arnold's face. Because, and you'll know this too, Matthew Arnold's most famous poem was Dover Beach, and it was well known to Joyce. It begins, "The sea is calm tonight." And since Stephen has been thinking about religion and heresy and belief, consider that the poem, Matthew Arnold's poem, also contains the famous line, "Sea of Faith." Just a thought. Okay, back to the text. Razor shells, well, you know what they are. Razor shells. And wood sieved by the shipworm, which is not a worm at all, but a kind of mollusk that eats into wood that's waterlogged and riddles with holes the way woodworm does. I'm sure on the beach you've seen rotted planking with, myriad holes in it. Lost Armada is, of course, the ill-fated Spanish Armada that foundered off the coast of Ireland in 1588 on its way to help an Irish rebellion. Although it sank, it sailed its way into Irish history and caught our imagination, and still does. I still go looking for traces of the Armada when I'm on the west coast of Ireland. Next Ulysses quote, Joyce again, "Unwholesome sandflats waited to suck his treading soles, breathing upward sewage breath. A pocket of seaweed smouldered in sea fire under a midden of man's ashes." Ooh, let me have a crack at this. Unwholesome sandflats waited to suck his treading soles, breathing upward sewage breath. Well, because of the primitive sewer arrangements in Dublin at that time, Stephen knew full well that his feet could be going into deep doo-doo very shortly if he's not careful, that these seemingly innocent stretches of soft sand might actually be hiding raw sewage, as the aroma seems to be telling him. How many senses does Joyce get into this chapter? Seeing, hearing, Now, smelling. The rest of that sentence is a touch more oblique and therefore more interesting. Here it is. A pocket of seaweed smouldered in sea fire under a midden of man's ashes. Well, a midden is a dump. It's an old Scandinavian word, and it comes from combining the words mud and dung, meudon. There's some seaweed on the beach and maybe a pile of ashes, and so we get the word sea fire, which is ambiguous here. If the ashes dumped from people's houses are still smouldering, they're giving the impression of seaweed being on fire. And by the way, that's what they did with their ashes. They threw them out on the beach. But sea fire is that green phosphorescence you sometimes see, if you're lucky, on the surface of the ocean. I've seen it out in the Atlantic, and I've seen something very like it in Greece. I don't know if it's the same thing. And as a word, this is Joyce again, it's close to samphire, which is a sea growth, a kind of sea lichen. And in King Lear, Edgar, in that same stretch that I quoted from, tells his father that there's a man halfway down the cliff collecting samphire. Joyce's synapses again. Samphire, by the way, is Saint-Pierre, comes from Saint-Pierre, which is St. Peter's herb. The botanical name is Chrysanthemum maritimum. And some people may try to tell you that camphor, used for making mothballs, comes from samphire. Don't believe them. Next bit, he goes to them, it's the unwholesome sandflats, walking warily. And listen to this. A porter bottle stood up, stogged to its waist in the cakey sand dough. A sentinel, isle of dreadful thirst. Two voices there. Joyce's, up as far as dough. A sentinel, isle of dreadful thirst, is Stephen. Now this is one of the best images to me in Ulysses. I've always remembered it since the first time I read chapter 3. Look how clearly we see it. And look at the word stogged. This is where I get excited. It's almost onomatopoeic, but it's better described as phonetically symbolic, I think. And stog is an older word than you might think. It goes back several hundred years. And it seems to have mutated from meaning a stab, and then meaning poking a marshy ground with a stick, and then meaning something sticking up out of soggy ground. A porter bottle stogged to its waist. Can't you just see it sticking up there out of the damp, heavy sand? What's left? Broken hoops on the shore, at the land, a maze of dark, cunning nets. Now, who's speaking here? This is where Joyce merges completely. This is why I adore the man. It could be either voice. It could be Joyce himself. It could be Stephen. I'm giving it to both of them. Broken hoops on the shore. Okay, so that's a Joycean description, but it could be Stephen observing it too. At the land, a maze of dark, cunning nets. Hoops, the remnants of wheels, bicycle wheels, or perhaps the sustaining hoops from beer casks, which would link back to the porter bottle. And I love the maze of dark, cunning nets, and this is a harking back to Stephen's own intent in a portrait of the artist. Remember, happening a few months before the beginning, before June 1904, before the beginning of Ulysses. And here's the quote from a portrait of the artist. When the soul of a man is born in this country, meaning Ireland, this is Stephen talking, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me, he says to his friends, you talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets. I'll try to escape nationality, language, religion. And remember his trinity of weapons: silence, exile, and cunning. Joyce was such of a piece in so many ways, so consistent. And the last reach of this week's passage, and this is great as well. Farther away, chalk-scrawled back doors, and on the higher beach, a drying line with two crucified shirts. Now that's Joyce. Ringsend, that's the name of the place, a suburb of Dublin. Wigwams of brown steersmen and master mariners, human shells. That's Stephen. He's looking at the backs of the houses in Ringsend with graffiti on them, houses where stevedores and dock workers and merchant sailors used to live close to the port of Dublin. And then, as so often happens in Ulysses, comes another Christ image. Ulysses teams with them. A clothesline with two crucified shirts. The housewife has pegged them out with their sleeves along the line. That's something you do if you've starched the shirts so that they'll dry evenly, and therefore they look like torsos drying in the sun. 2 crucified shirts. Lovely. I'll be back here next week. Rejoice, episode 115, French Fun. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We left it last week with Stephen looking across the distance at the small houses in Ringsend at the edge of Dublin, where mariners live in their shells and shirts hang like crucified torsos on clotheslines. I'm still seeing that porter bottle standing up on the wet sand, stog to its waist. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the phrase Isle of Dreadful Thirst is, of course, a jab at Ireland's notorious drinking habits, to which, indeed, Joyce himself contributed. It's also, by the way, a swift reference to a moment in Homer's Odyssey, when Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, stops at the court of yellow-haired King Menelaus, his father's dear friend, and Menelaus describes how the daughter of Proteus, and this chapter, remember, is called Proteus, how the daughter of Proteus saved Menelaus and his men from abject hunger and thirst on the island of Pharos. Idothea, by the way, is the daughter's name. I love this stuff. Idothea. Here's this week's piece of text from Ulysses, more of the same, so to speak, that is, interior monologue, the thoughts of Stephen Dedalus, a.k.a. James Aloysius Joyce, or as they'd say in Dublin, James Aloysius Joyce. Here we go. He halted. I have passed the way to Aunt Sarah's. Am I not going there? Seems not. No one about. He turned northeast and crossed the firmer sand towards the pigeon house. Qui-vous a mis dans cette fichue position? C'est le pigeon, Joseph. Patrice, home on furlough, lapped warm milk with me in the Bar McMahon. Son of the wild goose, Kevin Egan of Paris. My father's a bird. He lapped the sweet lait chaude with pink young tongue, plump bunny's face, lap, lapin. He hopes to win in the roulotte. About the nature of women, he read in Michelet. But he must send me La Vie de Jesus by M. Leo Taxil, lent it to his friend. End of quote, and forgive my French. Now there you had some of Joyce describing Stephen actually walking, and then you had Stephen's own thoughts. And oddly enough, you may hate me for saying this, but oddly enough, this passage is fairly straightforward. I know it doesn't look or sound that way, but it is. Here we go. He halted. Joyce. I have passed the way to Aunt Sarah's. Stephen, saying he's past the little entrance to the lane that would take him to the street where his Aunt Sarah lives. Am I not going there, he asks himself. Seems not, he says. No one about. He turned northeast and crossed the firmer sand towards the pigeon house. That's Joyce. So Stephen decides not to visit the house of his Aunt Sarah and Uncle or Nuncle Richie. And then Joyce's voice describes Stephen's direction. That's par for the course in Ulysses. The pigeon house, a major factor in the electricity supply for the city of Dublin, but it was originally a kind of warehouse store for builders, augmented by a local shop owned and run by a man called John Pigeon, who in the 18th century had a good little trade there, selling food and stuff to passengers embarking on ships about to leave the port of Dublin nearby. Pigeon, who had a D in his name, has long gone. Today, Stephen would see tall towers of a generating station, and if you mention the pigeon house to any Dubliner, that's what they see in their mind's eye, 2 tall, slender chimneys rising above wide-open sand flats with a long, narrow sea wall. The point of mentioning the pigeon house here, that's what comes next. Think of Joyce writing this passage. He's abroad, living in Europe, and he has to imagine the route Stephen would have taken from Sandycove into Dublin if Stephen had wanted to walk along the shore, which Joyce himself probably did the morning after they threw him out of the Martello Tower in Sandycove. So when the pigeon house comes into his mind, he's reminded of a connection, a literary reference, hence the passage of French. A friend of Stephen's, when Stephen was a medical student in Paris, as Joyce himself was, offered to lend him an interesting French novel, La Vie de Jesus, or Jesus, The Way or the Life of Jesus, by Monsieur Leo Taxil. More on that in a moment. And the first passage of French we have here that you heard me quote earlier is a quotation from that book. Here it is again. And I'll translate for you, because Joyce has committed what I call a mortal sin in writing, using quotations from another language and not translating. It's just too showy and poncy, and it's ungenerous to the widest body of readers. Not everybody understands all languages. And after that, I'll tell you about Monsieur Taxil, and if you're at all like me, you will love him, and you'll see why Joyce was interested in him. He turned northeast and crossed the firmer sand towards the pigeon house. And now Stephen remembers this quote. Qui vous a mis dans cette fichue position? What got you into this position? That is Joseph speaking. C'est le pigeon, Joseph. That is Mary speaking. That is Joseph and Mary in La Vie de Jesus discussing how the Holy Ghost came to tell Mary she's pregnant with Jesus. The Holy Ghost was accustomed to landing in the form of a dove, a pigeon. Here's Joyce's love of blasphemy again. It's the pigeon, Joseph. But now to the real fun. I first came across the name of Leo Taxil several years ago when a country parish priest in Ireland told me that there was one recorded, mind you, instance of Satan being known to have come back on earth. And he came back in the form of a French writer in the late 19th century named of Leo Taxil. So naturally enough, being interested in Satan, I checked up on Monsieur Taxil and found that he was some dude. Actually, he could become a kind of hero of mine. He was a journalist, and yes, a blasphemer, who wrote La Bible Amusante, the amusing Bible, and this Life of Jesus, which he called the amusing gospel. They were basically satirical, denunciatory works. He hated organized religion, and he especially hated Catholicism, in which he had been immersed with the Jesuits since the age of 5. This isn't why he's a hero of mine, by the way. I'll clear that up in a moment. Since the age of 5, he was with the Jesuits, so much for their boast. Give me a boy until he's 7, and he's mine for life. Haven't we had this before? Wasn't the exact quote from the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola? Give me a boy before the age of 7, and I give you the man. That's not, as I say, that's not why Leo Taxil is a kind of hero. I'm not actually totally easy with blasphemy, because it offends many well-meaning people. I like Leo because Leo specialized in really cool hoaxes. In Marseille, and I hope I'm remembering this right, there used to be a dirty little alleyway that they called the Rue Taxil, because Leo, our boy, once electrified the entire city and port of Marseille by telling them that a change in ocean patterns had caused Marseille harbor in the Mediterranean to fill up with sharks. And indeed, the city spent quite a bit of money trying to get rid of them. And there were other huge hoaxes. I can't remember them now in detail, but there was one was about a city underwater somewhere that people flocked to look at. You could see it on sunny days, he said. And then there was a huge, long-running hoax regarding the Freemasons and I think the Vatican. I think that's right. However, if I go into this in any further detail, we'll never get through chapter 3. So let me finish this week. Patrice, home on furlough, lapped warm milk with me in the Bar McMahon, son of the wild goose Kevin Egan of Paris. Kevin Egan of Paris. You'll hear that name again. My father's a bird. He lapped the sweet lace showed with pink young tongue. Pink young tongue. Plump bunny's face. What's going on here? Lap, lappa. He hopes to win in the the Grand Lottery. About the nature of women he read in Michelet. Ah, Monsieur Michelet, the historian. But he must send me La Vie de Jesus by Monsieur Leo Taxil. Lend it to his friend. Actually, now that I look at it, this does need a lot more opening out than I can do this week and the time that I've allotted myself. The Kevin Egan thing is very interesting indeed, and I want to spend some time on that, and I'll do that next week. So let me tidy up this week by drawing your attention to the penultimate sentence. But he must send me La Vie de Jesus by Monsieur Leo Taxil. It's rare for Joyce, rare enough, in his internal monologues, to have a reference so directly couched. I mean, he practically gives you the name of the publisher of the book. Usually, as we've seen, the thoughts are random and oblique, the pinball machine mind, like we all have, one half-thought, cannoning into another thought, and so on. So this direct reference to Monsieur Taxil will tell you how much Joyce wanted to get Taxil's name up in lights. Not that it did Taxil any good. He was 15 years dead by the time Ulysses appeared in 1922. But didn't it keep his name alive? And isn't it time for another big nationwide hoaxer? Wouldn't that be great? I'll be back next week. Rejoice, episode 116, Rabbits and Geese. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Last week was a bit broken up, if you recall, on account of a gentleman named Leo Taxil, but I'm not going back there. He's too attractive a figure. By the way, did I mention that apart from being a blasphemer, he made his living writing pornographic serials, sort of sexy, really tacky actually, soap operas? Okay, au revoir, Leo. Though you'll hear his name at the end of the passage I didn't deconstruct last week. Here's the passage again. This is Stephen thinking. Patrice, home on furlough, lapped warm milk with me in the Bar MacMahon, son of the wild goose, Kevin Egan of Paris. My father's a bird. He lapped the sweet lait-chaud with pink young tongue, plump bunny's face, lapin. He hopes to win in the Gros Lot. About the nature of women he read in Michelet. But he must send me La Vie de Jesus by Monsieur Leo Taxil. Letter to his friend. Cependant, vous savez, moi, je suis socialiste. Je ne crois pas en l'existence de Dieu. Faut pas le dire à mon père. Il croit? Mon père? Oui. Schluss. Il lapse. Here we go. Patrice, home on furlough, lapped warm milk with me in the Bar MacMahon. Patrice is the real-life son of a real-life friend of Joyce, a man named Joseph Casey, who'd had a checkered past and was a kind of a fugitive in Paris, working as a typesetter for an American newspaper. He was actually more of a friend of Joyce's father. He was a Fenian, that is to say, a 19th century Irish political activist who was rather fond of dynamite. He was jailed for his alleged part in bombings in England, and later acquitted. Joyce, when he went to Paris to study medicine in 1902 and 1903, met Casey through his father's introduction, and then got to know Casey's son, Patrice, who was a soldier in the French army. They used to meet at a bar called the MacMahon. Let me tie that to the next sentence. Patrice, home on furlough, lapped warm milk with me in the Bar MacMahon, son of the wild goose, Kevin Egan of Paris. Now, you've got a bit of doubling up here. The Bar MacMahon was named after Marshal MacMahon, a disastrous French general of Irish descent. His ancestors were called wild geese. Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? And the wild geese were, we've had this before, I think, to begin with, those chieftains who, after the defeat of the Irish leaders in 1690 at the Battle of the Boyne, and the defeat of King James and the Jacobite cause in Ireland, defeated by King William of Orange, who acceded to the English throne, the wild geese fled the country, and they joined any army that was fighting against England, which was most European armies at one time or another. In France, they were often rewarded with high military office and land. In fact, there are many chateaux in France, great vineyards, with Irish names, Lynch, Hennessy, Kirwan, Barton, Clark, and they were, as I say, in part military rewards to the wild geese, who were called wild geese, by the way, because they were smuggled away from Ireland. They were fugitives. They were smuggled away from Ireland, listed as wild geese on the ship's manifestos, or so the folklore goes. But they were part of my childhood imagination, big time. They're part of the Irish psyche, the wild geese. And the chateaux, by the way, are, I think, known as the wine geese. And this term, wild geese, was later applied to any Irishman, especially anybody with any activism, history, or background, who exiled himself in Europe. So there they are, the French soldier with the Irish father, MacMahon, and the Irish activist with the French soldier, Patrice, and his father Casey. And there's Joyce, the medical student freshly arrived from Dublin. My father's a bird, thinks Stephen, recalling the ballad of Joking Jesus that we had earlier. And this heralds the Taxil blasphemous reference we're about to meet, and into which we went in detail last week, perhaps too much detail. Here we go. Here's the quote, I'm repeating it. He lapped the sweet lait-chaud with pink young tongue, plump bunny's face, lapin. The young soldier, who has a face like a rabbit, is drinking warm milk, lait-chaud. A rabbit, a hare, is a lapin. So we got the Joycean pun on lapping and lapin. He hopes to win in the Gros Lot, the lottery, win the jackpot. And then Stephen observes, About the nature of women, he read in Michelet, not Michelin, that's hotels and stuff. Michelet. Now, this is really interesting because it heralds something of which we'll have an entire chapter later, the Gertie MacDowell chapter, in about 16 or 17 years from now. Michelet was Jules Michelet, a big 19th century name in France. He called himself a historian, and it was history, Jim, but not as we know it. It was subjective and florid and passionate and sentimental, as is the chapter about Gertie MacDowell. And the book he wrote about La Femme would have most intelligent women today alternating between screaming and snorting in amused indignation. Woman was the temple of love, he essentially said, and pure beyond purity. And Joyce's Gertie MacDowell chapter, full of sentimentality about women, dances to a not dissimilar, though much lower grade, tune. It's much cheaper music than Monsieur Michelet's symphonic declarations about the overarching sublimity of woman. Well, actually, that's enough about that. But Michelet did shape generations of French patriotic sentiment. With a history of France, there was a huge bestseller there. Stephen doesn't comment on the fact that Patrice has learned his knowledge of women from Monsieur Michelet, although the comment is implied in the word at the beginning of the next sentence, the word but. But he must send me. He's not interested in the Michelet view of women, but he must send me The Life of Jesus by Monsieur Leo Taxil. And then Stephen says, lend it to his friend. This, of course, is the blasphemous gospel that Taxil wrote. And here come the comments between Patrice and Stephen. First, Patrice says of Leo Taxil's book, c'est tordant. Vous savez? Or c'est tordant, perhaps. Meaning, it's hilarious, it's a scream, it's a screech. Moi, je suis socialiste. Me, I'm a socialist. Je ne crois pas en l'existence de Dieu. I don't believe in the existence of God. Faut pas le dire à mon père. Do not tell this to my father. Because obviously the old bomber, Joseph Casey, is still a good Irish Catholic. And sure enough, il croit? Stephen asks. Literally, he believes? Meaning he's still a practicing Catholic who believes in God? And young Patrice, with a rabbit's face, home on furlough, says, Mon père, oui. My father, yes. He still believes. He's still a Catholic. And Joyce ends this moment of dialogue between the two young men in the Bar MacMahon with a word that's not included as dialogue, but yet it must be part of it. Schluss. S-C-H-L-U-S-S. It means, in German, the end. End of conversation. Enough is what Joyce is saying, is what Stephen is saying at that moment. Because then Patrice, with his pink young tongue and his bunny's face, laps the warm milk. But perhaps Schluss is also, and I think it is, a term like cheers or here's luck or here's to you among European drinkers. And it would be just like Joyce to use it for somebody who's drinking milk. Schluss too for this week. That's the end of this week. More of Stephen in Paris. Here, same time, next week. Rejoice, episode 117, Puce in Paris. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're still deep in Chapter 3 of Ulysses, later referred to by Joyce as Proteus, because it's full of changeability, and Proteus, the god of the sea, was an old shapeshifter. Deep in Chapter 3? We haven't hit its halfway mark yet, but it is the first of the denser chapters in Ulysses. Last week, we left Stephen Daedalus with his memories of meeting the son of a friend, Patrice Egan, in the Bar MacMahon in Paris, when Stephen was there as a student, as of course was James Joyce, and they talked about women and blasphemy. This week, Stephen continues his memories of the City of Light. Here's the next paragraph. It's still his thoughts we're listening to. My Latin Quarter hat. God, we simply must dress the character. I want puce gloves. You were a student, weren't you? Of what, in the other devil's name? P-C-N. P-C-N. You know. Physique, chimique, et naturel. Aha. Eating your groat's worth of mou incivé, flesh pots of Egypt, elbowed by belching cabmen. Just say in the most natural tone, when I was in Paris, Boulmiche, I used to carry punched tickets to prove an alibi if they arrested you for murder somewhere. justice. On the night of the 17th of February, 1904, the prisoner was seen by 2 witnesses. Other fellow did it. Other me. Hat, tie, overcoat, nose. Lui, c'est moi. You seem to have enjoyed yourself. That's the end of the quote. Now this is all interior monologue, and the opening phrases might be familiar to you since chapter 1, when Mulligan taunts Stephen about his clothes. If you need to refer back to it, go to episode 39 of these podcasts, and you'll find that Stephen is remembering almost word for word what Mulligan was saying in that podcast, that he himself wanted puce gloves and green boots. And also in episode 39, I told you that a Latin quarter hat is typically black, made of black felt, worn at a slouch, with perhaps the brim, which is quite wide, raised a little. There are photographs of Joyce wearing such a hat. Now, Stephen then says to himself, "You were a student, weren't you? Of what, in the other devil's name? PCN. PCN, you know, physique, chimique, et naturel." The other devil, isn't that interesting? The other devil being Lucifer, not Buck Mulligan. Maybe. Yes, of course it is. PCN is how in French you would pronounce the letters P, C, and N, if you were reading the French alphabet aloud, A, Grec, etc. And P, C, and N stand for the French medical school standard pre-medical studies, physique, chimique, et naturel. As Stephen then outlines, physics, chemistry, and biology. You know what I found interesting along here? That Stephen is thinking in sound. He may not be saying words aloud with his mouth, his voice, but he's thinking sounds, PCN. So, what do we have again? Ineluctable modality of the audible. Next. Aha! Eating your groat's worth of mouin civet, flesh pots of Egypt, elbowed by belching cabmen. Joyce was poor in Paris in his early 20s. He was dirt poor, poor as a church mouse, and he could only afford to eat, when he could afford to eat, something called mouin civet, literally soft stew of hare or rabbit. If it were posh, it would be called perhaps jugged hare. In Joyce's life, it was one of the cheapest dishes you could find. It was made from the lungs of animals, the leftover lungs after butchers had been through the beast for everything else. That's why cabmen ate it in Paris and belched. That's why it cost a groat. Do you remember a groat from the Bible? The word comes from the same family as gross, because a groat traditionally was a cheap coin, and therefore it was a thick coin. It was heavy, gross as in fat. And civet or civet, well, that's an English word as well, meaning a cat, specifically a cat Guinness, from which chemists get a derivative musk that's used in the manufacture of perfume. There you go. And now, why is Joyce, flesh pots of Egypt, why is Joyce reaching for Exodus chapter 16 here, flesh pots of Egypt? What's he up to? How many times have I asked that? What's he up to? Well, here's some stuff. A groat is a biblical word. Exodus is about wandering. In the wanderings of the children of Egypt in Exodus, they complained to their leaders, Moses and Aaron, that they wished they had stayed in the flesh pots of Egypt, where at least they'd have had bread to eat instead of nothing. Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For ye have brought us forth into this wilderness, to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Which is when God said, "Oh, all right," and rained down the manna on them. So Joyce sees himself as wandering among the flesh pots like a child of Israel. And he definitely didn't get a supply of free food. Nobody rained manna down on him. He had to ride home so often and tried to catch money here, there, and everywhere. What's next? Yes, Stephen muses like a well-traveled man. Listen to this. Just say in the most natural tone, "When I was in Paris, Bourmiche, I used to..." You get it? World-weary, man of the world. Name-dropping applies to travel, to faraway places too. But now we have an interesting and touching little sting. This is really interesting. Yes, used to carry punched tickets to prove an alibi if they arrested you for murder somewhere. Justice. On the night of the 17th of February 1904, the prisoner was seen by two witnesses. Other fellow did it. Other me. What kind of paranoia underlay that thought? Well, we know that Joyce had a lot of fears, physical fears, some of which came from having been decked once or twice as a drunken student. And he didn't have a brawler's physique or enough freedom from inhibition to set up a fight. But this is something else entirely. Let me get stuck into this. I'd love to have been able to see into Joyce's study or workroom when he was writing Ulysses, because I want to know what newspapers he had there. When I saw this date, 17th of February 1904, I began to trawl through any references I could find. And in the Freeman's Journal, which was the Dublin newspaper of the time, a daily newspaper, it later became and still is the Irish Independent, I find for Friday, February the 19th, 1904, beside the shipping news column, I find the following entry. City murder charge. I haven't checked the other Irish newspapers, by the way, but I'm quite sure it's there. City murder charge. And it continues, yesterday, in the Southern Court, before Mr. Swift, that was the judge, Patrick McCarthy, who was under remand, he'd clearly been arrested and charged, was again charged with the wilful murder of his wife Teresa. It's a short report, and from my point of view, there are two things that fascinate me. One, that Joyce, when he was writing Ulysses, must have had a Dublin newspaper for that day in February 1904, or had made a note from it. He was living in Dublin at the time. Secondly, the woman who was murdered was pregnant, and as a result of the killing, the child was stillborn. And we've already had in this chapter the idea that the sand by the shore, the sand Stephen is walking on, was used for hiding the traces of aborted fetuses or stillborn children. So what are we watching here? We're watching synapses firing again. And there's some play now as Stephen thinks of the alter ego. Other fellow did it. Other me. Hat, tie, overcoat, nose. Louis, c'est moi. You seem to have enjoyed yourself. There's three levels at work here. There's King Louis XIV, the sun god, who famously said, L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. There's Gustave Flaubert, who said of his great heroine, Madame Bovary, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Madame Bovary, she is me. And Joyce says of his mythical murdering self, Lui, c'est moi. Him, it is me, with the French pun on Louis and Louis. And there's something here worth watching for, because you'll see it again and again. I will draw your attention to it, but it's lovely if you spot it. Joyce's interior monologue was greatly influenced by a book named Les lauriers sont coupés. The laurels or the bay trees are bare or cut or felled. And it depends on the reader. The whole book depends on the reader being admitted to hearing an inner voice. And as I say, of this matter, you'll hear a great deal more as we proceed, because the writer, a man called Dujardin, made a point of distinguishing. This is wild oversimplification from me, by the way. Wildly oversimplified. Dujardin, who wrote Les lauriers sont coupés, he, in constructing, and he's generally credited with having been the first novelist to do so, to let us into the character's thoughts, he's generally creating a distinction between the ego and the not ego. We all have it in us. We all have more than one person in us. And here is Stephen with one side of his self addressing another. And we all have more than one self anyway. Do you ever try to count the number of yous you have in you? And what is it? Of course, it's part of the shape-shifting literary ethic of this chapter. You change the I you are to another I that you still are. You seem to have enjoyed yourself, says Stephen to himself. Haven't we all done that? Addressed ourselves as you? Moi? Watch this space for more of the same next week. Goodbye until then. Rejoice, episode 118, Shaking and Shooting Hello, I'm Frank Delaney, and on we go with Chapter 3 of Ulysses and Stephen on Sandymount Strand. Consider, by the way, how Joyce used a broad open vista, a seascape, against which to set some of his densest, most impenetrable prose. Outer space versus inner space. Or was that also what he meant by the chapter's opening words, ineluctable modality of the visible? Here's the next paragraph after Kevin Egan and Leo Taxil and blasphemy and warm milk and all that stuff. This is all interior monologue, and where I can't pronounce a word, because it isn't a word, it's a sound, an invented onomatopoeia, I'll try the best I can, and then I'll spell it for you. Stephen is still thinking of his days in Paris when he used to hang out on the Boule Mich, the Boulevard Saint-Michel, if for no other reason than he wanted to say in an easy and well-travelled way that he used to hang out on the Boule Mich. Here we go, still on Sandymount Strand. Proudly walking. Whom were you trying to walk like? Forget. A dispossessed. With mother's money order, 8 shillings, the banging door of the post office slammed in your face by the usher. Hunger, toothache. Encore 2 minutes. Look, clock. Must get. Fermé. Hard dog. Shoot him to bloody bits with a bang shotgun. Bits man spattered walls, all brass buttons, bits all crack in place. Clack back. Not hurt? Oh, that's all right. Shake hands. See what I meant, see? Oh, that's all right. Shake a shake. Oh, that's all only all right. End of quote. See what I mean by invented onomatopoeia? Krrrrklak. That's the body hitting a wall, presumably, or a gun firing, or something like that. Right, here we go. Proudly walking. Stephen is thinking that he's playing a character now. Whom were you trying to walk like? Good question. And if he does, forget, as he says, he yet has an immediate answer. A dispossessed. Now, that needs some unpacking. Do you recall a podcast episode in which I mentioned a fellow named of Linati? Carlo Linati? Now, what episode was it? Actually, it wasn't an episode. It was in an article that I wrote for the excellent Public Domain Review. You should Google the review. It's a cultural website out of the UK, and it's got some of the best pieces all across culture. They're all wonderfully well written. Last month, for instance, they had a piece on Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, being a reporter at the London Olympic Games in 1908. The name again? Public Domain Review. Well, I wrote a piece for them last Bloomsday. The details are here on my website with all the links. I wrote a piece on Joyce and Impressionism, and in it I mentioned that in 1920, for Carlo Linati, the Italian translator of his play Exiles, 1918, Joyce produced the Linati Schema, a breakdown of Ulysses. It was, by the way, an elaborate document, and he was elaborate too in the drawing up and explaining of it. On the 21st of September 1920, Joyce wrote to Linati, who wanted to write about Ulysses as a work in progress for some magazine or other in Italy. And this is what Joyce said. He said, I think that in view of the enormous bulk, I'm quoting directly now here, and the more than enormous complexity of my damned monster novel, it would be better to send a sort of summary, key, skeleton, scheme for home use only. It, the novel, is the epic of 2 races, Israel, Ireland, and at the same time the cycle of the human body, as well as a little story of a day, life. The character of Ulysses has fascinated me ever since boyhood, Joyce says. I started writing a short story for Dubliners 15 years ago, but gave it up. For 7 years I've been working at this book. Blast it! It's also a kind of encyclopedia. My intention is to allow each adventure, that is, every hour, every organ, every art, being interconnected and interrelated in the somatic scheme of the whole, to condition and even to create its own technique. Each adventure is, so to speak, one person, although it is composed of persons. Now, to Linati, he also pointed out, and that's what's really relevant this week, he also pointed out that Stephen, as in Joyce indeed thought of himself, is a dispossessed character, as was Shakespeare's Hamlet, as was Jesus Christ, two young men who did not, Joyce argued, come into their family kingdom. In the case of Christ, this was, of course, another blasphemy, because Catholic teaching says that Jesus Christ was God and therefore not dispossessed by his Father. And if you remember, that's part of the philosophical discussion early in this chapter 3. Okay, clear about that? Next bit. Here's the quote. With mother's money order, 8 shillings, the banging door of the post office slammed in your face by the usher. This is Joyce, a.k.a. Stephen, still in Paris, desperately needing money, and trying to cash in the money order that his mother has sent from Dublin. But the post office official wants to close the door, and Joyce strokes Stephen, who has a toothache from hunger. It's the hunger headache spread down to the gums, and it does, I assure you. You can get a headache from hunger. I'm food-driven, I know. Joyce strokes Stephen, yells at the post office tyrant, "You don't close for another 2 minutes!" Hunger, toothache, encore 2 minutes. And he then leads the man through pidgin English. Look, clock. Look, 2 minutes to go, he's saying. God, isn't that familiar? Closing the door 2 minutes early. I especially hate it with restaurants when they stop serving earlier than the time they advertise. Stephen taps his money order in the usher's face and says, "Must get, must get." But the tyrant says, "Fermé." And Stephen's monologue intérieur turns violent. He imagines these words: "Hard dog," that's the post office person. "Shoot him to bloody bits with a bang shotgun. Bits, man, spattered walls, all brass buttons." Self-explanatory? I think so. And interesting structurally, well, technically, mimicking the action with the chopping sentences. And here comes the nonsense. Bits all crack, in place clack back. Not hurt? Oh, that's all right. Shake hands. See what I meant? See? Oh, that's all right. Shake a shake. Oh, that's all only all right. Now watch. This is all fine on the surface. Stephen's fantasy is to blast away at the post office official who closes the door adamantly at 2 minutes before the appointed hour, which means that Stephen will go hungry again tonight in Paris because he hasn't been able to cash the money order that his mother has sent him from Dublin. So, in his imagination, he blasts the man against the wall in a disintegration of flesh and uniform fabric, including the brass buttons, and then he puts him back together again. Clack back. Not hurt? Now come the verbs. Shake hands. See what I meant? See? Oh, that's all right. Shake a shake. The word shake 3 times and the word see twice. See? Ineluctable modality of the visible. Oh, sure. And shake? Well, as you well know, the word shake can be synonymous with change, and this is the chapter of change, which is why Joyce, in his Lenata Schema, as it is now known, the Lenati Schema, it's why Joyce called chapter 3 of Ulysses after Proteus, the god of the sea, the god of change. I must, by the way, do a complete podcast one week. Or perhaps I'll do one of the Baker's Dozen on the said Lenati Schema, which I love looking at while I marvel at Joyce's capacity for mischief. More here next week. Rejoice, episode 119, Sadness and Souvenirs. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. For the last few episodes, we've been in Stephen's memories of Paris as he trudges across Saint-Mont Strand, peering into the distance. I wonder how much we should take into account his limited view of things, his limited view of what's visible in all its ineluctable modalities, given this fact, given that on the previous day, and this is why I use the word limited, Stephen broke his spectacles. He hasn't got any spectacles, and he's short-sighted. Nearsighted. But we won't come to the broken spectacles until we reach the Ormond Hotel, and that'll be about the year 2024. Now, today, Stephen, in his memory, is about to quit Paris. He's remembering that, and he's only been there a few months, starving, academically unproductive months, and he went there to become a doctor, remember? So this is what he's thinking, and it's an interesting passage this week, with one stunning little narrative device. Here we go. He's thinking, you were going to do wonders, what? Missionary to Europe after fiery Columbanus, Fiacre and Scotus. on their creepy stools in heaven, spilt from their pint pots, loud Latin laughing, huge, huge, pretending to speak broken English as you dragged your valise, porter threepence, across the slimy pier at New Haven. Comment? Rich booty you brought back, le tutu. 5 tattered numbers of pantalon blanc et culotte rouge. A blue French telegram, curiosity to show. Mother dying, come home, father. End of quote. Right, here we go. You were going to do wonders, what? Missionary to Europe after fiery Columbanus. At the end of a portrait of the artist as a young man, Stephen defies his mother and goes into exile, just as the great medieval Irish missionary Columbanus defied his mother and went into exile. In fact, Columbanus stepped over his mother's prostrate body as she lay in the doorway trying to stop him. We've already had that. Do you remember it? You can find it in episode 66. And as Columbanus was spreading the gospel of Christ, Stephen was going to Europe to spread the gospel of art and the gospel of thought and the gospel of ideas, and now he accuses himself sardonically because he has failed. He didn't do wonders. Fiacre and Scotus on their creepy stools in heaven, spilt from their pint pots, loud Latin laughing, huge, huge. It means, aha, aha, look at you. Fiacre, F-I-A-C-R-E, like Columbanus, was an Irish evangelist in Europe. Even more interesting, there was a hotel in Paris named after him, and the horse cabs in Paris became known as fiacres because the hotel was one of the places where they used to line up waiting for clients. Scotus, S-C-O-T-U-S, that's Duns Scotus, a 13th, 14th century Irish or Scots philosopher and theologian of whom Joyce is fond, because Scotus was something of a rebel. Now, given, as I'm always saying, that Joyce never did anything for no reason, why are these two here? Here's why, in my humble opinion. They're both credited with spreading the word of God, so with Columbanus that makes a trinity, a concept that Joyce returns to again and again in Ulysses. There's a trinity there of Fiacre, Scotus, and Columbanus. And each had something in common with Joyce. Columbanus, as I've just said, went into exile against the wishes of his mother. And remember, Joyce was writing Ulysses long after he himself had gone into final exile. Scotus was a philosopher with a particular interest in human uniqueness, full name Johannes Duns Scotus, Johannes Duns Scotus, and therefore brought the word dunce into the English language, because that was the name given to him, Duns Scotus, by William Tyndale, the Protestant reformer, who came along a couple of centuries after him and hated Scotus's teachings. Dunce. Ah, damn it. One word origin and I'm any girl's. As I say, Scotus was a favourite of Joyce's. Dunce. Don't you love that? I didn't know that until about 4 or 5 years ago when I heard that the word dunce was in use here in the United States, where I now live. I remember it as a child, but I didn't realize it was in use in America as well, so I looked it up, and that's where it comes from, Duns Scotus. As I say, Scotus was a favourite of Joyce's, and Joyce believed that in the particular is the universal, and in chapter 3 he is actually, all through the chapter, discussing the same thisness of the moment that Scotus propounded. In a sense, that's what chapter 3 of Ulysses is all about, the essence of the moment. And Fiacre. This is interesting. Fiacre is the patron saint of those who contract venereal disease. So we may ask ourselves, and this will arise again next week, we may ask ourselves, in what condition did Joyce return from Paris? So there you have Fiacre and Scotus on their creepy stools in heaven, spilt from their pint pots, loud Latin laughing. A creepy stool evolved over time to mean a 3-legged stool that a farmer creeps under a cow's udder to milk. It was originally, I think, a stool. It had 3 legs, yes, but it was cut from the base of a tree. Just imagine the round part of a tree, or the bole of a tree. And loud Latin laughing, huge, huge, well, that's, as you gathered, is an ironic term of applause. Rest of the paragraph, pretending to speak broken English as you dragged your valise. Porter, 3 pence, across the slimy pier at New Haven. Comment? Rich booty you brought back, le tutu. 5 tattered numbers of pantalon blanc et culotte rouge. A blue French telegram, curiosity to show. Mother dying, come home, father. Pretending to speak Broken English, Joyce stiffed the porter at the English Channel port of New Haven by pretending to speak only French, comment, meaning a range of things in French, excuse me, how, what, and so on, so that he could get away with a tip of threepence or no tip at all. Rich booty you brought back, le tutu. 5 tattered numbers of Pantalon Blanc et Couleur Rouge, girlish magazines. Le tutu and something called white pantaloons and red culottes or white underwear and red knickers or whatever. And the magazine never existed, but others did with not dissimilar names, and Joyce conflated them all. And he was all drawers anyway, and we'll come to that underwear stuff one day too, that he's so loved. Fair play to him. Last piece this week, and here comes that stunning little narrative device I promised you. A blue French telegram, curiosity to show. Mother dying, come home, father. That's the exact quote. Along with the doubtful magazines, and note the use of the word booty, which in itself conveys doubtful goods, along with his booty, Stephen is bringing home a curio of everyday French life, a telegram, which is blue, because that's what French telegrams were. They were blue forms. And in his mind, he casually remembers, curiosity to show, an intriguing little whiff of France to show the folks at home in Dublin. But, wait for the kick in the gut. Here's the stunning little device. Stephen had been the recipient of this telegram. And what had it said? Mother dying, come home, father. Which is precisely, by the way, what was in the telegram that John Joyce sent to his son in Paris. Now, how about that for a way of delivering a massive payload in a narrative? Deep sadness, really bad news, displayed as a curio. So look what we have this week. Failure resulting in great loss, patron saints of body, mind, and spirit, and a vivid, ongoing, almost subliminal discussion of the chapter's underlying concerns. The man was a genius. More of the same next week. Rejoice. Episode 120A, 5 More Dubliners. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. It's that time again. Another 12 episodes gone by, and here's my baker's dozen, my 13th edition, so to speak, the bonus, which typically doesn't have a lot to do with Ulysses directly, and more with Joyce himself, who of course has everything to do with Ulysses. By the way, may I say now and here, my heartfelt thanks to all of you who have made up 500,000 and more downloads of these podcasts in just over 2 years. It's immensely gratifying to me. It has given me a great feeling of fellowship, of kindred spirits, and spurs me to ever greater efforts to make these podcasts even more enjoyable for you, more accurate, more authentic, more accessible. I'm putting more and more work into them, and I love all your comments. And one day soon, I'll do an omnibus reply edition that picks up on some of your points. And by the way, as a little give back, as a little return, as a token of my appreciation, a number of you have asked for longer editions of podcasts. Well, this 13th edition is always an opportunity to do that. So this week, we have really a long version of the podcast. And actually, having said that, I'm immediately going to shorten it, and I'll explain why. The last bonus podcast featured the middle 5 of the 15 short stories of which Dubliners is comprised. Let me remind you of the titles so far. In episode 105A, back in June, I featured the first 5, The Sisters, An Encounter, Araby, Eveline, and After the Race. And then the next one we did, which was on the 6th of July, I think, I looked at 2 Gallants, The Boarding House, A Little Cloud, Counterparts, and Clay. And now today, I'm shortening it. I was going to focus on 5. I've just decided I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do 4. And they are A Painful Case, one of my favorite stories in the collection, Ivy Day in the Committee Room, to which there's a very funny story attached, A Mother, Grace, and I'm keeping the last story in the collection, The Dead, for the next bonus podcast, because it's such a mighty story. But you know, and it's also the longest story in the collection, but I could do that with all of them. For example, one day, this is just a detail, just one detail, and they'll give you an idea of the magnitude of the task. One day, I'm going to explore Joyce's interest in Henri Fournier, a motorbike champion from the last days of the 19th century. He's in After the Race. He's one of the characters related to the story After the Race. And one of the things I want to investigate, and I'll do it here, was I want to investigate whether that interest somehow spawned Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Because Godot, in one of the alleged, what would you call them, manifestations, incarnations, probably is a better word, was in fact a cyclist. So I just wonder whether there was a connection there. But there's an old Irish saying, Sin scéal ella, meaning that's another story. Sin equals that is, scéal is story, ella means other. So, onward, with a reminder, this bonus edition, 4 stories, and they are Ivy Day in the Committee Room, A Mother, Grace, and, to begin with, A Painful Case. As I said, I love this story. Now, it's got a bunch of interesting things surrounding it. But let me start with the story itself. Here's the opening sentence. And remember, Joyce was 23 when he wrote this and living in Europe. Here's the sentence. Mr. James Duffy lived in Chapelizod because he wished to live as far as possible from the city of which he was a citizen, and because he found all the other suburbs of Dublin mean, modern, and pretentious. Next sentence. He lived in an old, sombre house, and from his windows he could look into the disused distillery, or upwards along the shallow river on which Dublin is built. And the third sentence. The lofty walls of his uncarpeted room were free from pictures. Now, already, we have shapes forming, we have character forming. And by the way, the word Chapelizod, Chapeliz or Z-O-D, which looks peculiar in an Irish context with that Z or Z in it. It comes from the Chapel of St. Iseult, an old monastic settlement, and I'm not the only person to have heard it pronounced in Dublin as Chapelizod. Joyce also used it, by the way, used Chapelizod as his setting for the protagonist H.C. Earwicker in Finnegan's Wake. Now, in A Painful Case, Mr. Duffy of Chapelizod is a bachelor with an ascetic, an austere, and unadventurous life. He lives in digs, works in a bank, does the same things at the same time every day of his life, has a full head of dry black hair and a tawny moustache, never gives alms to beggars, and is fond of Mozart. One evening, at a concert, he meets a lady and her young daughter, and he's drawn into conversation. 2 more such meetings, and Mr. Duffy asks her out on a date. But she's married to a sea captain, and yet they have several secret dates. Mr. Duffy, however, being a man of conscience, wants nothing to do with stealth, and he obliges the lady to invite him to her home, where the husband thinks that it's the young daughter Mr. Duffy is keen on. Why does he think that? Here's the explanation, and it's one of the most devastating sentences that Joyce ever wrote, in my opinion. Here it is. He, the sea captain that is, had dismissed his wife so sincerely from his gallery of pleasures that he did not suspect that anyone else would take an interest in her. So he thinks Mr. Duffy is coming after the daughter because he can't imagine anyone finding his wife attractive enough. What a guy. Well, the affair continues because the husband, being a sea captain, is away often, and the daughter is out in the evenings at music lessons. And then one evening, well, no, I'm not going there. Actually, that's the right thing to do, is to stop here, in case you haven't read the story, or if you have and forgotten it. I do urge you to read it, by the way. So just let me make some tangential remarks about it, or as they'd say in Dublin, tangential. The lady's name is Mrs. Emily Sinico, or Sinico, S-I-N-I-C-O. She's 43, and Joyce took her name from the name of a singing teacher and composer in Italy, Giuseppe Sinico. I expect that Joyce was intrigued by the word sin in Sinico. It's a bleak story, A Painful Case. It's a story with no winners in it, and it has a remarkable depth. The resonance, the specific gravity is just terrific. Joyce thought himself he didn't actually like it. He said he thought it was weak, and I think it's really as strong as any of the stories in Dubliners. And finally, it has a famous sentence in it. a sentence that's always attributed to Joyce as one of his beliefs, because it's in this story. But it wasn't Joyce's sentence. It wasn't original to him. It came from the journal of his brother Stanislaus, who had literary aspirations, who had met a married lady at a concert, and who wrote down various aphorisms in the kind of training to become a writer. And here's the famous one that Joyce stole from his brother and put into a painful case. Mr. Duffy, like Stanislaus, has scribbled down his own thoughts, and one of them is, and here's the quote, "Love between man and man is impossible, because there must not be sexual intercourse, and friendship between man and woman is impossible, because there must be sexual intercourse." And by the way, as another little bit of Joyce was accused of taking this story straight from the pages of the Dublin newspapers because of its similarity to an incident that actually happened near where the lady lived. Indeed, a near identical occurrence. I won't give it away because it's a crucial part of the plot. The trouble, and such a story did appear in the Dublin newspapers, but the trouble with the accusation is that the incident that appeared in the newspapers happened 4 years after Joyce wrote the story. And by the way, if you are reading it for the first time, take it slowly. In fact, maybe even read it out loud to yourself or to someone you love, because there are some truly wonderful sentences in it. 23. I could throttle him. Right. Next up, Ivy Day in the committee room. I wonder how many people have ever seen an ivy leaf worn in someone's lapel on the 6th of October. The great political leader in 19th century Ireland was Charles Stewart Parnell, of whom Joyce's father was an avid follower. Parnell was undone by an affair with the wife of a political colleague, Kitty O'Shea. He had fathered children by her, and his political enemies made sure that the sleaze flowed like fast-flowing mud, and it stuck to him, and it dragged him down. As a child, I still heard people lamenting his fall. There's a big lament for Parnell in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, because John Joyce, Joyce's father, was a big Parnellite. And it's believed that his crash from power actually hastened Parnell's death. He lost his party, he lost his place in the world. He was only 45. He did win Kitty. He was only 45 when he died. And, here we go, the ivy leaf. His bereft followers commemorated him for decades by wearing his symbol, the ivy leaf, on the sad anniversary of his death. Well, Joyce's story here, Ivy Day in the committee room, is about politics, specifically about no politician ever being able to measure up to Parnell. Story opens on a miserable day. In fact, the story happens on a miserable day, and in a political party's committee room on Dublin's Wicklow Street. An old man is poking the fire and a young man is lighting a cigarette. The young man is a canvasser. He goes to door canvassing votes for a candidate in forthcoming elections. And he doesn't want to go out in the rain because his shoes let in water. He's not very well off. He has some desultory exchanges with the older man, and other men drift in. They include a Mr. Hines and a Mr. Henchy. Good Dublin names. And both men largely based, it's believed, on Joyce's own father, on aspects of his character. A youth from a nearby pub brings in a dozen bottles of stout porter. He's given one for a reward, and he drains it there and then. And the political talk in the committee room continues. In the previous story, A Painful Case, something happens. Not in this. Unless you count a dramatic recitation of a rather maudlin poem about Parnell's death. He fell as fall the mighty ones, nobly undaunted to the last, and death has now united him with Erin's heroes of the past. Here's what this story does. Imagine that you could take a day and see it as a long, narrow, silver bar of continuum. Now reach down and cut a linear chunk from that bar, take it away, and scrutinize it. That is what Joyce does in this story. It is, of course, what he does to an even greater degree in all of Ulysses, except that there he has the entire day as an entity, and he makes you believe that somehow he has captured all the activities that happened in Dublin on the 16th of June 1904. Here we have, what, an hour more, maybe a few hours, of men talking in a shabby upstairs room in a street in Dublin's inner city. They're looking at a fire that's slow to flame. And Joyce knew that he was doing this. His sentences that move the action, if that's not too strong a term, they show it. Listen, here, two men entered the room. Simple as that. That's about as dramatic as the action gets. He then describes the two men. And he has a good device here. The men already in the room have been discussing one of the newcomers before he arrives. So we're primed for the guy ever before we meet him. One of the great values of this story is a certain immediacy. You are in the room. You are eavesdropping. And you are privy to political views that range from socialism to conservatism. And they give you an idea of the political life of the city on that day, at that time, in that moment, in that room. There's an interesting and amusing sidebar to Ivy Day in the Committee Room. One of the characters in the version finally published refers to the then king, King Edward VII, popular king, son of the long-lived and long-reigning Queen Victoria. She was 64 years on the throne. And here's the remark. They're talking about the king possibly visiting Dublin. Now, even though he was popular, that didn't mean that everyone would welcome him. Certainly in Ireland at that time. And a character says, here's this chap come to the throne after his old mother keeping out of it till the man was grey. In other words, he couldn't become king until she died because she wasn't going to abdicate. Well, the book Dubliners ran into trouble with the publishers, not least because of this remark, which was seen as disrespectful. Joyce's finally offering, he's totaling, he's finaling off, if you like, of the argument happened when he sent the book to a new publisher, when he thought, before the new publisher had a chance to read it and object, Joyce changed the sentence. Now, the original sentence was, here's this chap come to the throne after his old mother keeping him out of it till the man was grey. Well, here's what Joyce changed it to. Here's this chap come to the throne after his bloody old bitch of a mother keeping him out of it till the man was grey. Naturally enough, the publisher wouldn't have it. And a huge row followed. And Joyce, trying to win the argument, which he didn't, wrote to the king, asking him, do you mind if I describe your mother like this? The king's men, the king never saw the letter, the king's men wrote back saying, in essence, no comment. Ha! Now, our third story of the four, I love that story. Love that story. That's so typical of Joyce. Somebody objects to something, so he doubles the reason why they object. Our third story of the four is a mother. Now, it's a really good example of the book's general accomplishment, to portray the people of Ireland's capital realistically in such a way that we can recognise what it must have been like to live in Dublin then. Joyce had his own views on how he portrayed them. He had the impression that he couldn't write without offending people. And he also acknowledged that in Dubliners he exercised what he called a scrupulous meanness. And he said that an odour of corruption floated over the stories. Now, nowhere is that meanness and corruption, petty, small, local corruption, more evidenced or better evidenced than in the story A Mother. And here we really do see Joyce's great thesis at work. In the particular is the universal. The setting is one that Joyce himself knew well, the world of Dublin variety concerts, evening events in which tenors and sopranos took part among poetry reciters and sometimes jugglers and ventriloquists and magicians. The mother of the title, the mother is a Mrs. Carney, who is married to a man older than her, a bootmaker. And Mrs. Carney, I'm now quoting, Mrs. Carney respected her husband in the same way as she respected the General Post Office, as something large, secure, and fixed, and though she knew the small number of his talents, she appreciated his abstract value as a male. The pair have daughters, the elder of whom, Kathleen, plays the piano sufficiently well to be an accompanist at a Dublin concert. A gentleman named of Hoppy Houlihan, or Houlihan, he has a limp which is why he's called Hoppy. I shouldn't laugh, but that's such vicious bit of Dublin humour. Hoppy is a kind of dog-eared impresario, and Mrs. Carney cultivates him with the decanter and the silver biscuit barrel, so that she can get Kathleen an engagement in a series of 4 evenings about to be mustered at the ancient concert rooms, where, by the way, Joyce himself once sang in such an event. Miss Carney gets the gig as an accompanist and is chaperoned, no, she's shepherded by her mother to the event. And now the fire starts to fly. Now it really starts to heat up. As usual, I won't spoil either your memory of it if you want to read it again, or your enjoyment of it if you're about to read it. But it won't ruin it if I quote some of the lines. He was a little man with a white, vacant face. And there's a tenor who was extremely nervous and extremely jealous of other tenors, and he covered his nervous jealousy with an ebullient friendliness. There's a soprano wearing a faded blue dress, which was stretched upon a meagre body. And there's a suave elderly man who balanced his imposing body, when at rest, upon a large silk umbrella. These are indeed all Dubliners, and believe it or not, there's even some tension in this story. And we associate tension with plot, don't we? And plot is not something we associate with Joyce, is it? Her mother, though, has the resonance that made all these stories memorable. Joyce here is superb a characterization, and even in his early 20s, he has the gift of drawing in the reader by creating people with whom we can identify, or not, but who will number among them people and traits, individual personality traits and character traits that we recognize. Story number 4, the final story in this podcast. There are 14 in the entire collection, and the penultimate story in Dubliners is named Grace. It begins when a man has fallen downstairs. 2 other men in the bar, emerging from the men's room, find him and carry him back upstairs, where they lay him gently down. A crowd gathers and sees how, and I quote, a dark medal of blood had formed itself near the man's head on the tessellated floor. Nobody knows who this man is. They force brandy into him. He revives. And then a man whose name is Mr. Power comes through from the end of the bar, recognizes him as his friend Tom Kiernan, takes over and brings Mr. Kiernan home to the long-suffering Mrs. Kiernan. She puts him to bed. She's done this before. The matter is a little complicated because in the fall, Mr. Kiernan bit off a tiny part of his tongue. How's that for a metaphor for you? Mr. Power rounds up some friends, Mr. Cunningham and Mr. McCoy, and next day they gather in Mr. Kiernan's room when he has sobered up. These, by the way, are names and characters that we'll meet one day in the pages of Ulysses. That's why Dubliners, as well as Portrait of the Artist, is a kind of primer, a primer, if you like, for reading Ulysses. So in time, in Mr. Kiernan's room, they're joined by Mr. Fogarty, and here's Joyce's description of him, Mr. Fogarty, a new character. A pale oval face came forward into the light. The arch of its trailing moustache was repeated in the fair eyebrows, looped above pleasantly astonished eyes. Mr. Fogarty was a modest grocer. He had failed in business in a licensed house in the city because his financial condition had constrained him to tie himself to second-class distillers and brewers. He had opened a small shop on Glasnevin Road, where, he flattered himself, his manners would ingratiate him with the housewives of the district. He bore himself with a certain grace, complimented little children, and spoke with a neat enunciation. He was not without culture. So, this is where we've been heading under the story's title, Grace. Grace is not confined to Mr. Fogarty. Grace is attached to the men who have gathered to talk to Mr. Kiernan. And Mr. Fogarty's appearance is the end of the second act or the beginning of the third act. And now the idea of grace as a spiritual matter begins to take hold. It's almost as if Mr. Fogarty is an angel who has brought grace into the room. For me, the delight I take in this story is manifold. The resonance of Joyce's father and his behavior in so many ways. One character has a wife whom he kept installing in new houses, but she pawned everything every time they moved because she needed the money for drink. So that's how the facets of Joyce's father keep surfacing. The warmth of acquaintance here carries over with some memorable people. Martin Cunningham, for instance, whose goodness dominates the story. Now, he has true grace, even if he does get things wrong and is a bit pompous. And the accuracy of the portrayal of lower middle class Dublin, the shopkeepers, the clerks, the commercial travellers. In this collection of stories, Joyce was, you might say, nation building. He was displaying his own particular city as he intimately knew it, and thus showing us the universe. So there we are, a painful case. Ivy Day in the committee room, a mother, Grace. Were I to use one word to define their greatest collective asset, I'd reach for the word humanity. But then I'd also want to say atmosphere and shrewdness and acuteness and understanding. I hope Dubliners is taught forever in English literature classes, in part or entirely. And in my next bonus edition, 12 weeks from now, is that right? 12 weeks from now, yes. I give myself the great pleasure of taking you through the final story in the collection, The Dead. And don't forget to join me for business as usual next Wednesday with episode 121 of Rejoice, all 500,000 of you, and more. Goodbye until then.